Hey everyone, welcome to the Blockchain Law Show. I'm your host, Anki Kwan. I'm a California lawyer, and in this episode, I'm going to go over how Kik's video in 2017 throws a wrench into their argument that they recently submitted to the SEC. So what the heck am I talking about? In my last video, I talked about Kik's arguments to the SEC about why they shouldn't file an enforcement action against them. In November, the SEC staff notified Kik they were going to recommend the SEC file an enforcement action against Kik, and they told Kik that they could respond with what's called a well submission to explain why the SEC shouldn't pursue this enforcement action against them. Kik responded, they submitted a well submission to the SEC, and they had three arguments. One is that kin is a currency, and currencies are specifically exempt from the definition of a security under the Exchange Act of 1934. The second argument is that kin isn't a security under the Howey Test. This is the test that the SEC has used in every enforcement action to determine whether tokens are securities. And the third is that they complied with the law based on what they understood about it at the time that they did their token sale. We're going to focus on Kik's second argument, which is that they aren't a security under the Howey Test. The Howey Test is a four-prong test, and we'll just review the test briefly. Howey requires you to have an investment of money in a common enterprise, and the buyers have to expect profits based on the efforts of others, namely the efforts of the person that is selling the tokens or whatever investment opportunity there may be. If you meet all four prongs of the Howey Test, you're a security, and under US securities laws, if you're a security, you have to either register your offering or sale or find an exemption. The only argument that the SEC will be making is that Kik violated the registration requirements of the securities laws. That means they didn't register and they didn't qualify for any exemption. So the first thing they'll have to do is make the argument that the kin tokens or the kin token sale are securities under the Howey Test. Kik argued that their tokens aren't securities under the Howey Test, and they base this on three arguments. They tried destroying three of the four prongs of the Howey Test, and specifically they argued that there isn't a common enterprise because Kik's only job was to give tokens to investors. As to the expectation of profits prong, Kik argues that the buyers couldn't have expected profits because Kik only marketed the tokens for consumptive use, so buyers couldn't have expected profits based on what they told buyers about what kin tokens can be used for. And they didn't state to buyers that they could use these tokens in order to make money, but they emphasized what they could do to use kin tokens in the kin ecosystem. And finally, they argued that they couldn't have made the tokens more valuable because Kik isn't the only person or player that's required to make these tokens more valuable, and that it's more like Ethereum in that Ethereum had to rely on other people participating in the ecosystem in order to make Ether more valuable, even though initially Ethereum had to use those initial efforts to create the ecosystem and spearhead the initial efforts. And likewise, kin has to spearhead the initial efforts in order to get things going, but eventually kin will be decentralized, and it won't be Kik's efforts that would make these tokens more valuable, but rather everyone who participates in the Kin ecosystem. Those were the arguments that they made in their well submission. You only have to fail one prong of the Howey test to be considered not a security, and according to them, they failed all 3 prongs of the Howey test. Recently, a website called ETH News unearthed a video that they made in June 2017. Their CEO, Ted Livingston, he did a talk about the Kin ICO in San Francisco, and it was recorded and uploaded on YouTube. In that video, he made a few comments which can really weaken the argument that they made in their well submission. I really encourage you to watch that video to see exactly what he said. I can't really repeat what he said on this video because I don't remember his words exactly. So I'm just going to summarize some of the points, but if you want to know exactly what he said in that video, I encourage you to watch that YouTube video. I'm going to link it down below in the description box, so if you want to watch it, I encourage you to watch it. In the video, he was doing a Q&A, and in answering those questions, he made a few statements that can be pretty detrimental to the argument that they made in their well submission. A few highlights from the Q&A include the following. He stated more than once that Kin will be placed on exchanges, but in their well submission, they stated that when asked if Kin was going to be placed on exchanges, they basically told people asking those questions that it was up to the exchanges. But in the video, he specifically says that Kin will be on the exchanges. He also said that they have an economic interest in the Kin tokens because they own 30% of it, and it was in their best interest to ensure the value of Kin going forward. He also stated that they had to use efforts to make the Kin ecosystem work, and that they would make significant efforts initially to ensure that the Kin Foundation becomes decentralized. So KIC would be the ones that moves the foundation from being centralized to decentralized, and they would bootstrap the value of the Kin tokens with the KIC app. Ted also said, when asked about how equity investors would share in the upside of the Kin tokens, Ted responded, "Kin were as popular as Ether today. We have 30% of the Kin tokens, so that means it would be worth $9 billion. If you're an investor and you invested $50 million, then give you $500 million out of the $9 billion. So that's a pretty good deal." So it's unclear about whether equity investors are the only investors that would participate in this upside, or if other buyers of the tokens would also participate in this upside, because the question was only about equity investors. But anyway, that's besides the point. The point is that these were the arguments that Ted, the CEO of KIC, made in his Bitcoin presentation about the Kin ICO. In light of the statements that are now unearthed, what does that mean for their Howey argument? So let's go back through all the elements of Howey and apply what Ted said to the Howey test. Howey requires an investment of money in a common enterprise where the buyers expect profits from the expectations of others. As to the common enterprise prong, KIC argues that there is no common enterprise because our only job is to give you the tokens. In cases where courts have found a common enterprise, some of these cases look at whether the investors' profits and losses are bound up in the company's profits and losses. That means if the company makes money, will the investors also make money? And if the company loses money, will the investor also lose money? This is usually in the case of investing in a company's shares. If a company does well, then their shares increase in value, whereas if the company doesn't do well, the shares lose value. And the company and investors, they share in this increase in value, and they also share in any decrease in value. In the token sense, token holders don't own any equity stake in the company. So the question is, if the tokens increase in value, does the company also increase in value? And here, Kik gives 30% of their tokens to the Kin Foundation. By the CEO's own statements, if the Kin tokens increase in value, then they would also have an economic interest in this because they own 30%. And according to Ted, if it increases like Ether, it could be worth $9 billion. Based just on this statement, it would seem that the company does have an interest in the increase in value of the Kin tokens. Even if he didn't make these statements, the fact is the Kin Foundation, which is created by Kik, owns 30% of these tokens. So if these tokens increase in value, then it's an increase in economic interest of the company. And if these Kin tokens increase in value, the buyers of these tokens, if they had held onto it, they also can benefit from the increase in value of these tokens. So here it seems that a common enterprise can be found based on the fact that Kik has held on to 30% of the tokens. So if they did anything to increase the value of the tokens, then the buyers would also be able to participate in that increase. For the second prong, or the third, because we skipped the investment of money prong, because we know that buyers gave them money so that they could get Kin tokens. So the third prong, which is expectation of profits, the question is, do the buyers of these tokens expect to make a profit off of their purchase? Kik says that they never said anything that would make buyers expect to make a profit from buying the Kin tokens. They stated that the only thing that they've publicly said to buyers was that they can use the Kin tokens in the Kin ecosystem. And based on this, they shouldn't have any expectation of profits because they never said anything giving them those expectations. In the video, there's a different story. There was a person in the audience that specifically asked, what are you going to do to ensure that the value of Kin tokens? And the CEO responds, well, we can't ensure the value of Kin tokens, but we own a 30% stake in Kin, so it's in our own interest to make sure that it's valuable. And you can say that as a buyer, you expect a profit based on this statement. That's one argument that you can make. And another person in the audience also asked, what does the increase in value of Kin mean for equity investors? And Ted specifically said, if Kin increases in value, then we'll give some of that value back to our investors. The question here is, who exactly are the investors? If Kin increases in value, will only the equity investors share in the increase in value? What about the people who purchase these tokens? Are they purchasing it based on what they heard in this presentation about how Kin or Kik has economic interest in these tokens and will ensure that these tokens will be valuable? Are they making their investments based on other sources of information that Kik gave them? Specifically, did they buy these tokens because Kik told them that they can use these tokens in the Kik app. We don't know what the answers to these questions are, and the only people who can tell you how they made their investment decisions are the investors. As to the third prong, if the buyers do expect to make a profit from buying these tokens, will the tokens increase in value because of the efforts of others? Kik argues that the increase in value is based on other participants in the ecosystem, and Kik's efforts alone won't make the tokens valuable. In the video, on the other hand, the CEO specifically said that initially Kik has to use a lot of effort to make the kin ecosystem go from a centralized ecosystem to a decentralized ecosystem. And they're also the ones that have to bootstrap the value of kin by putting it in the Kik app. I don't think putting the tokens in the Kik app alone are the efforts that make the kin ecosystem successful. But I think the fact that Ted said they have to ensure that the kin ecosystem goes from centralized to decentralized, I think that is what those are the efforts that a court would look at and decide if those efforts are the so-called undeniably significant efforts that would make this ecosystem valuable and therefore the kin tokens valuable. Kik has 30% of the tokens, and in order to encourage developers to develop on the kin ecosystem, they have to give these developers kin tokens so that they'll be encouraged to develop in the ecosystem. It's not some other buyer that would buy tokens to give to developers. It's Kik that will give these tokens to developers. So the question is, are these the efforts that would make the ecosystem valuable? And if it is, then it can be argued that these are the undeniably significant efforts of the company that would make the ecosystem and therefore the kin tokens valuable. Under the Howey test, you only have to fail one prong to fail the Howey test and to be considered not a security. The question is, can Kik fail at least one of the prongs of the Howey test? I think that the prong that they can arguably fail is the prong of whether the buyers really expected to make a profit off of buying these kin tokens. I didn't look at the kin ICO, so I have no idea what they were telling buyers during their ICO. Were they telling their buyers that they would make money, or were they telling their buyers that they would be able to use the kin tokens on the kin app? I have no idea. But just because they're telling buyers on their website that they can use kin tokens to participate in the kin ecosystem or to use it in the app, what were they saying outside? Was Ted going around giving these talks and recording them and putting them onto YouTube? And were investors looking at these videos and deciding to buy the kin tokens if they couldn't participate in the pre-sale? That's another thing that we have to look at. I think I mentioned this in my past video that Kik bifurcated their token sale into a pre-sale and the actual ICO. In the pre-sale, they sold their tokens to so-called accredited investors using a SAFT. This is called a simple agreement for future token, and this is based on the simple agreement for future equity model. In the simple agreement for future equity model, the SAFE is a security, and the reason investors invest in a SAFE is because it's quicker, it's cheaper, and it's faster. And these investors know that the company will raise a subsequent round. So when they raise money in that round, these investors go in and they buy these securities at a cheaper price than the next round of investors would. That's why they invest in using a safe. They get a discount on their shares, so they get more for their money. In the SAFT, the idea is that the ecosystem isn't built yet, there's no token yet, so these investors are investing and they're using the money in order to create the token and the ecosystem. And the idea is that once the ecosystem and the token is live, then buyers can buy it for consumptive use. But we don't know whether this token, which is now usable for consumption, is actually purchased for consumption, or if buyers are buying these tokens for investment purposes. We know that in a safe, the equity you get from a safe is a security, but we don't know if the tokens you get from a SAFT is a security. The equity you get from a safe is the same equity that you buy as an equity investor when the safe converts into equity. Likewise, the tokens you buy in the ICO are the same tokens that investors buy in the SAFT. So are these tokens securities, or are they just tokens for consumptive use? We don't know. And I think the question hinges on whether buyers are buying these tokens because they expect to make money from their purchase, or are they buying it because they're expecting to use it for some purpose? If it's true that Kik told their users or buyers over and over again that it was only for consumption, and they never said anything to suggest that these tokens can be bought for investment purposes, then I think they have a pretty good argument that buyers shouldn't be expecting to make a profit by buying these tokens. But the fact that Ted made these statements in the video during his talk about how they would make these tokens more valuable, that they would put these tokens on an exchange, and how they would share the upside of the increase in value in investors. I think that really weakens the argument that buyers weren't expecting to make a profit from buying these tokens, unless they can show that buyers really weren't exposed to this information, that buying these tokens can make them a profit. But if they had been exposed to this information, then that would really weaken their argument. But in the court case, the SEC has the burden of showing that there is a security under the Howey Test. So the SEC has to prove all 4 prongs of the Howey Test to prove that Kik offered and sold securities in violation of the securities laws. Unfortunately, this video gives the SEC more ammunition to use against Kik in their argument that Kik had offered and sold a security in violation of the securities laws. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please share. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a great day. Oh, and by the way, I really wanted to thank everyone who watched my last video and liked my last video, and I also want to thank everyone who subscribed to my channel. I think I had more views on the last video than I had for all of my other videos combined, and I really wasn't expecting that, and I really wanted to say thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. All right, now I'm really getting off. Bye.